Why did we have Super Tuesday? What created this whole thing, this national primary on Tuesday? Because a man by the name of Fabian Nunez is sitting around his ornate office in Sacramento, who's turned out this year with his political consultant, a very bright one by the name of Gail Kaufman, trying to figure out how can they do something about term limits so they could spend another 6 years in the Assembly and remain a speaker. He said, what we need to do, because the primaries in June, filing for to run for re-election to the state legislature begins this Monday.
It's probably for me.
It's the governor. Filing for re-election to the state legislature begins this coming Monday. It goes through, I think, around March 12th, around that date. So they came up with this idea of trying to con the electorate that to come up with the system. When we put a ballot measure and put a proposition on the ballot, that word in such a way that it looks like we are tightening term limits, 14 to 12, when in fact what they're really trying to do is get another 6 years in the state assembly. But they needed an election before the June primary. So they came up with the idea, well, let's have a presidential primary in February. They go to Arnold, and the governor thinks, boy, this is a terrific idea. We'll be able to have some clout. But this really is so they could get a term limit measure on a February ballot that would be passed by the electorate so they could file next Monday for re-election to the state assembly. And so what happens, Arnold goes with the idea, because there's no way they would be able to get the money to have a special election purely for term limits extension, and of course it would go down in glorious defeat if that was sold as. And so the governor bought on it, and all the legislators, of course, because remember, they're under current law, 37 state legislators are termed out this year. If 93 had passed, that number would be 0. In other words, every one of them would be allowed to seek re-election on the assembly line up to 6 years. And so what happens? The governor of the legislature passed it, put up the super duper February 5th. Then what happens? Well, New York says, well, if you're going to have it in February, we want it in February. And all of a sudden, Illinois says that. So all these states decided to, Massachusetts, if California's going to do it, we are too. So the political ambition of one young man by the name of Fabian Nunez is probably going to impact who the next president of the United States is going to be. And that's the way politics works. Yeah. And it failed. I think the reason it failed, by the way, I like the idea of 12 years. I think it's a reasonable reform. But those politicians promised two things to the voters, that they would tie it into a package where we'd have redistricting reform, term limit reform along with redistricting reform, taking the drawing district lines out of the hands of the politicians and do some type of independent commission. They tried to pull a fast one. It didn't work. And Steve Poizner and others made sure that no committee had enough money to be able to tell the electorate that in fact it weakened term limits rather than toughened it. And in fact, by a narrow margin, much narrower than I thought, it was defeated. John McCain did very well here in California, obviously. I'm not telling you anything you don't know. What was very interesting on the McCain votes, when you looked at those that voted absentee, and by the way, 6 million people have made an application for an absentee ballot here in California. We have 4.5 million permanent absentee voters here in California. 40% are Republican, 42 Democratic, about 15% independent. But you look at the McCain vote, early voting, he was about 18 points behind Romney, 18 points ahead of Romney. The reason being, up until Florida, Romney is still a total unknown character by most voters in this state. Remember, he spent all his money in Iowa, then going to New Hampshire, then a little bit in South Carolina, then pulled out, then went over to Florida, nothing California specific. Most voters don't have the foggiest idea who Mitt Romney was, what kind of governor he was in Massachusetts, or anything about him. But and so most of the vote went to John McCain, because by far, A, he's a conservative, and B, he was the best known of the candidates. There was a slight Romney surge at the end. On election day, McCain was only about 8 points ahead of Romney. I think after Florida, with the Rush Limbaughs and focus on the family and some of these hardcore, right-wing nuts, started making all this noise, a lot of conservatives, they got the idea that McCain might be too liberal, and they were looking at Huckabee, they were looking at Romney. In fact, there was a slight surge, but there's no way in a state as large as California was Romney able to do anything in 1 week to change what was already pretty much established that McCain was going to carry California. And boy, did he get a bucket load of delegates. The Republicans, for the first time, had 53 winner-take-all primaries in each congressional district, regardless of the registration. Nancy Pelosi, there are 30,000 Republicans in Nancy Pelosi's congressional district. Orange County, Dana Rohrabacher's, there are 200,000 Republicans. Whoever got the most votes in Rohrabacher's got 3 delegates. Whoever got the most votes in Nancy Pelosi got 3 delegates. McCain carried, I believe, 59 to 50 of the 53 congressional districts. And he's going to get all but about 6 of the delegate votes. And I don't think those have been counted in the national figures as yet. Right now, I think he has well over 55% of the delegates needed. I think it will calm down as far as the so-called resurrection about the professional pundits and on the political right. I think part of this has nothing to do with politics, but purely with personalities. They just don't like him. During the 8 years of George W. Bush's presidency, the White House political operation, and that we mean Karl Rove, I don't want to use the word pander, that might be too strong, but they used to pay a lot of attention to these hardcore conservative on the religious right. They'd call them up all the time, ask their advice, get their input, and really would massage them as much. And I think they got a little bit about some sense of self-importance, thinking that they probably had a greater role in the Republican Party than they really do. A lot of my liberal friends really believe these people run the Republican Party. Well, you're going to find out between now and Labor Day that no, they don't. It's the voters in the United States of America, Republican voters, who are going to determine the nominee, and not so many of these individuals. I think it's going to be a tough campaign. And what's interesting about about McCain's campaign, one of his chief strategists, if not the chief, is Steve Schmidt, very bright young political consultant, and he's the one who put together Arnold Schwarzenegger's re-election campaign, against Angelides this past year. He really understands California. He understands how to put coalition politics that's more than just rising up the base. And I think he's going to be able to put together the type of campaign that could almost realign the Republican voter rather than just emulating what past Republican candidates have done while trying to put together a electoral majority. Anyway,